Welcome to another Ag Gateway Global Network video. I'm Jim Wilson, President of Ag Gateway Global Network, and with me is Ben Craker from AGCO. Ben will present an ADAPT overview. Ben, please tell us what you do for AGCO and Ag Gateway, and then move into your presentation.
Like Jim said, my name is Ben Craker. I'm a product manager for data partnerships and standards globally at AGCO. So I'm pretty involved with several of the Ag Gateway projects, one of them being ADAPT. So today I just kind of go through a high-level overview of what ADAPT is and how it works in high-level detail like that. So basically, the high-level goal of ADAPT is to turn precision agriculture into just plain agriculture and have that be the way that things are done and not have it be kind of unique. As everybody's familiar with the trends and all the reports on how many people we have to feed over the next 10, 20 years and the production enhancements that are going to be required from that. ADAPT is one of the things that's kind of an underlying technology aimed at enabling a lot of that to happen. So where we use the diagram of, the rising tide lifts all the ships. So it's something that should help enable data analysis and other things to really kind of take off, where there's a lot of work involved with that from several people's perspective within the industry. So ADAPT is aimed at helping solve that issue. So the goal here is to enable customer choice and also foster innovation. So one of the big barriers that a lot of people see in the industry today from a software or FMIS or even terminal manufacturer is the amount of different data formats that are out there. As a startup software company, if you want to be able to do anything with data coming off of machines, there's huge effort that's needed to figure out how to read all these different formats and integrate them into your own system and be able to actually do something and provide value with the data that you're bringing in. So ADAPT is hopefully going to help alleviate some of that pain that's involved with that. It should really help drive adoption of precision technology in general by reducing the hurdle to entry on the data management format topic. So ADAPT started kind of as an offshoot of the SPADE project within Ag Gateway. So I just wanted to give a quick overview, a couple slides on what SPADE is and how it kind of led to ADAPT. So that's where SPADE is a standardized precision ag data exchange. So there's been several versions of the SPADE project, and it's really focused a lot so far on documenting processes that happen in the field. So what happens when a farmer decides he's going to go out and plant a crop? What's the whole process involved in that? What data is needed by which players in that whole chain? And then just trying to document that so people can have a good understanding of what all's involved. So through that, there were 5 core documents that were identified, and that we just kind of helped frame the conversation around different pieces of information a farmer or one of his service providers is sharing at any point in time throughout that whole process. So once we've identified those documents and we've mapped out how the whole operation occurs, we generally take the data elements that are identified within that process and benchmark them against the standard. Generally, it's ISO 11783 standard. But depending on the project, there's a different one going on where we're looking at the AgXML standard, a few other things being looked at, but basically to make sure that standard meets the data requirement needs for the players in that operation. So that's where we work with different organizations to get minor changes and additions made to standards that are already existing to make sure they fit those use cases we've identified. And also led to things like a reference data API, where there's the plan to have a standardized API structure to be able to get reference information about inputs and machines and other relevant information. So this is kind of the development process that we'll start out with. So on the left, you start out with a pretty high-level user story, very conversational, just kind of subject matter expert on how different operations happen. And then as you move through the different steps, you get a little more technical each way or each step to the right. So you can have use cases that are a little more specific, and then what we call data buckets, which is essentially all the data elements needed within that process. That's where we gap check it and then working on publishing all the documentation along the way. So we found there's real value to a lot of companies in being able to look at those use cases, the data buckets, and everything that goes into that, not just in implementing the final standard at the end. So there's been 3 different versions of the SPADE project so far, and that's where I said it's covered a pretty good majority of field operations. that occur on a farm. So we have a pretty good database of all the data elements that are required for a wide variety of farming operations. And that's kind of what helped lead to ADAPT, is identifying that, hey, we need all this different data. There's a lot of different formats out there. The industry as a whole struggles with managing all these file formats and converting them. So that's where the idea came out for the ADAPT project, to provide a framework and a tool to be able to manage all those different file formats a little bit more easily. This is kind of the vision of how data management and farming would look in the future once ADAPT is implemented, the reference data API is available. So up in the upper right corner, you can see where reference data is feeding in from a manufacturer, whether that's a feed, chemical, other crop inputs, even equipment, can provide reference information about the different products the farmer is using. And that can go into the ADAPT framework to manage all that different data. Field operations go out, so you're sending work orders out to machines, you're receiving work records back. Things happen in the field, and that's still all linked to that reference data. And ADAPT helps Farm Management Information System read all that data accurately without losing anything, and then be able to export it back out. So if you need to generate a report or send it to another software system, that becomes a lot more streamlined, and you don't have to worry about losing data because of a format that you choose at that point of export. So this is just kind of how the core documents are related that feed into all this. So at the top in the center is kind of the big one. That's the crop plan. That's, what a farmer is going to do in a field for a certain amount of time. That'll drive, recommendations that maybe I need to go out and plant this seed at this population in this area of the field and a slightly different hybrid in this area of the field. So once that decision is made on what the recommendation to do is, a work order is generated that is, sent to the machine or sent for execution in the field. It's based on reference and historical data. In the middle there, that kind of feeds into everything. The field operation actually happens. And then you get the work record back on this is what actually happened, because it's not always 100% the same as what the plan was. And then there's observations and measurements that feed into all that. So if you have a crop scout going out there to see what's going on, they're going to tell you that, hey, there's a infestation of some insect in this area of the field, so that needs to feed into this whole loop. So on the next slide, it's a little bit of an example of how this whole process works from the farmer standpoint. So he's going to start in the middle there, send the crop plan out, and then he or a service provider might go out and do some scouting, collect some soil samples, other observational data. They'll bundle that up with history and records on that field. Likely, a lot of guys are going to work with that service advisor and agronomist, somebody to help pull all that information together, and that advisor is going to make a recommendation on what should be done. And then it's up to the farmer to choose when, how, and through what method that gets implemented. He generates a work order. In this case, he sends that to another service provider, potentially for some sort of application. And then that work record comes back to the grower, and then he's able to generate reports for regulatory or other purposes. And the scope of ADAPT is really focused on those work records and work orders. So that's the different formats and things that are out there that a lot of, that's where we see the stumbling blocks in implementing all the different formats out there. The crop plans and other core documents aren't probably as structured within the industry. They're highly varied in how formally they're put together and used depending on the operation. So there's, different levels of sophistication there where, something could be completely drawn out and spreadsheets and pretty detailed plan laid out, or it could be as simple as, a guy's got an idea in his head and just communicates verbally to somebody on how he's going to manage a field. So that brings us into ADAPT. So it stands for the Ag Data Application Programming Toolkit. And like I said, the problem is that customers really just expect this stuff to just work together. They don't really care if they have machines of different colors or a different software system. The expectation is it should be pretty easy to get data off of a machine and into their computer system or over to a service provider without a whole lot of effort. But we're not quite there yet. So as an industry as a whole, we spend a lot of effort, like I was talking about earlier, in translating this data, reading it in, and translating it between different formats. For the farmer, oftentimes they end up being required to use multiple software systems because one doesn't support a file format that they need to use, and then they try to export it out of one system into another. And that's where ADAPT comes in. As an open source project, helps solve all those different file format issues. So ADAPT is, a lot of compromise goes into that because we had, during the development, a lot of conflicting views on how to do things, how different data is handled within different terminal manufacturer system, how different FMIS looks at things. So there's been a lot of compromise that goes into it. That's kind of one thing we always preface people at, the first time they start looking through the data model and other things. Anything that looks messy, there's probably a pretty good reason for it. Weeks-long debate over a series of meetings on getting it to that point. Because it's a very comprehensive data model that's designed to basically be a superset of all those data formats that are out there. So when you read data in from one format into the FMIS, nothing's lost due to the format as it passes through ADAPT. So there's extensive documentation available on the Gateway Wiki site on discussions going back over the years on how decisions were came to and why things are the way they are. And there's several people with a lot of knowledge in this area. But everybody's at a pretty good point now where no real one company was the overall winner in how everything got worked out. It was a pretty good compromise, I think, between everybody involved. But we're able to provide a solution that I think will work for a pretty broad swath of users. So just kind of a little background on who's been involved with this so far. You can see the list on the screen there of companies that have been participating in the technical and business team calls, helping develop it, contributing to the data model, working on plugins, things like that. So there's, as you can see, a pretty broad spectrum of players from across the industry, whether they're software companies, machine manufacturers, crop insurance, other technology providers, so seed and chemical companies as well. So that's where we have a really good view of all the different, from the SPADE documentation, what kind of data elements are required within a model to be able to handle all these different formats. So, part of what the issue here is the ISO standard was developed and managed by the AEF that was really meant to help solve this problem. So there's a ISO 11783 standard that is out there for machines and basically tractors and implements used to communicate with each other. And through that, you can kick out a file format that's an ISO XML file. But the trouble with that standard is everybody has a little bit different opinion of the implementation of the standard. So it didn't end up resolving the whole issue. Same thing when you look at Esri shapefiles. There's differences between whose shapefile you're looking at and how data is actually structured in that. And then there's several OEMs out there that just have their own proprietary unique data format. And then we have legacy hardware running around. And then the software systems that need to try to consume data from all these different sources. So that's where the ADAPT framework comes in. I guess, that's one thing to point out is that the ADAPT framework is solely focused on file format conversion. So it doesn't do anything about transferring data from one system to another. It doesn't do anything about data privacy, ownership, or security. It's really just focused on getting it from format A into a software system and back out to format B if necessary. So that's a clear point we like to make sure that everybody's aware of on what the real purpose and intent of ADAPT is. And I mentioned it is an open source project, so anyone is able to go onto the GitHub site and look at the code and help contribute to that. There's weekly technical meetings where they review all the pull requests as they come in for improvements, enhancements, and bug fixes. So it's a volunteer community. We've worked really hard within the ADAPT project to create this kind of vibrant open community there where we have a lot of input and involvement from different people. Because for ADAPT to be successful, we need to have a lot of people implementing it, a lot of people contributing to make sure it's fitting the needs for the industry. So a little background on that, the Eclipse public license was chosen by the ADAPT team with the guidance of an open source consultant that we hired. So that was a license for the software that worked for all the different players where people are able to take it, modify it, and integrate it into their system without worries that somebody's going to sue them over using it or changing it, and also managing what's required to be contributed back in from anybody that implements it. There was a lot of research that went into that. We've had several different companies look at it since we selected it, and I don't know of anyone that's had a real barrier to using ADAPT because of the license that was chosen. So I think we did a pretty good job working through all the different licenses out there and what actually fit for this application we're working on. So kind of the core components to ADAPT. So obviously you've got the FMIS software system that will be implementing the framework. Then you have an MICS or a terminal essentially that will have a plugin associated with it. So each terminal that has its own proprietary or even the ISO standard data format will have a plugin that goes along with it that's specifically designed by that terminal manufacturer to handle mapping their format into the ADAPT overall framework. So that's where you have the ADAPT overall framework that FMIS would implement and then license these plugins from the terminal manufacturer So when you put all those pieces together, the plugin actually handles reading in whatever format it's meant to handle. And then that goes into the DAP framework, which the FMIS can then read through that way. So this just kind of shows how all the plugins fit in together and, hook into an FMIS. And the logos listed on there are all companies that have committed as of InfoAg to build a plugin for their format. So you see a lot of the main players in the ag industry are involved. And in the upper right, the ISO plugin is actually part of the ADAPT framework. So when you go in and look at it, there's kind of 3 components that are all under the Eclipse open source license I mentioned earlier. So you get the ADAPT framework, that's kind of the plugin manager and how everything works. You get the ADAPT data model, which is, the superset of all these formats essentially to handle all those data elements. And then there's also the ISO plugin, part of the development as well. So any FMIS that integrates ADAPT will, under the same open source license, be able to use the ISO plugin, allowing them to get a AEF. The plan is to have an AEF conformance tested plugin. So there's a high level of certainty that that plugin is reading ISO as the AEF defines ISO. And that'll help drive a little bit further standardization in that plugin, because that terminal manufacturers will need to ensure that their version of ISO works with that plugin, or they will have to, essentially develop their own plugin for their specific kind of ISO. So that'll help a lot with FMISs that have historically struggled a little bit with all those slightly different flavors of the ISO standard. So on the next slide, there's a little bit different example of how this flow would work. So if you start in the very middle there, you have the file that's generated from a field computer or terminal as a work record. In FMIS-A on the left, they would read that file in through the plugin for that file, through the DAP format, and integrate it into that FMIS program. From there, they might want to export that data back out to FMIS-B. So that's what's happening along the bottom there, is it's going back through the DAP and out to an ADAPT format. So we actually have the ability to serialize the entire data model, which was originally developed for testing, but also works very good in this use case, where you need to get data out of one system into another. To do that today, you would have to select one format that both FMISs support, and then hope that format doesn't lose any of the data that you're trying to send. So if there's a limitation on what all information you're trying to send from one system to another, there's potential that that's lost based on the format you select. Whereas if both FMISs have implemented ADAPT, shown in this diagram, that ADAPT data model, as I mentioned earlier, is a superset of all those different formats. So there should be 0 data elements lost going from one system to another. So it helps enable that transfer. And the node in the middle underneath that cloud, again, ADAPT is not meant to handle any of the actual transfer of the file. So you'll get a file out, but it's not going to be hooked into a cloud platform or anything unless that particular plugin developer has built that functionality into the plugin. ADAPT itself is not going to manage any of the translation. It'll just, kick out a file or files depending on how that format works. So that's one kind of important thing to keep in mind, again, on what ADAPT does and does not do. So as I had logos earlier, these are companies, basically terminal manufacturers, that have committed to developing a plugin. So you can see, like I mentioned earlier, it's a lot of the main terminal manufacturer companies in the industry are committed to doing this. Several have plugins under development currently, so they will be available on the market soon if they're not already. And then for an FMIS that's integrating ADAPT, they would just contact those companies to see how they're licensing that plugin to those companies. So some may choose to do it open source or through some license similar to that. Some may have a different process for licensing that. But I know, like, if you go to the Deere website, they've got the developer.deere. You can get information about being able to license their ADAPT plugins. It's already available there. So just kind of an update on the status. That's usually a big question from a lot of people on if ADAPT is done and ready. The answer is yes, it's ready, but I don't know that it'll ever be done. As with most software, it's always continually changing and evolving. So the framework, the plugin, and the data model are all available, like I said, on GitHub for companies to download and start working with, and with their developers. So the ISO plugins there, the DAP plugins also available there. It's been, kind of a small core team working on a lot of this, so that's where we're really at the point now where, we think we have a pretty good solution that meets the needs for a pretty broad swath of the industry that I showed that was involved, but We really need people to start implementing the ADAPT framework and letting us know if there's any big hurdles to using it with their particular system. And then submitting pull requests and being involved and providing feedback so we can continue to enhance it and make it better. So that's where we're really engaging. We've worked a lot to get that list of companies that are terminal manufacturers to commit. Currently in the process of kind of doing the same thing from a software provider companies to get a list put together on who all plans to implement the framework. Calling it done, it'll be difficult to ever be completely done, I think, but it's in a really good spot for people to start implementing and providing feedback on it. So if you want to learn more or get involved, a good place to start is the adaptframework.org website. That has links to the GitHub repository, documentation on the wiki, other information about an upcoming workshop in Berlin scheduled. There's a poll you can take on there where we're getting feedback from growers and other users on how difficult data management is to help provide basically the backup information companies need to present this to leadership that can make this a priority to implement and support the ADAPT project. So we have a lot of feedback that's been gathered there. Overall, that's a good jumping off place to get into anything on ADAPT. There's a summary on kind of what it is and what I've gone through today here a little bit. If there's any questions or you want to get started implementing it, that's a good place to go. From there, you can get in contact with the oversight committee that kind of manages the pull requests and kind of keeps everything in sync on the development of the tool itself. And as I mentioned, there's a weekly business team call as well as a weekly technical team call, so we can get you set up to be on those if you don't already have the invite. So as I mentioned, if you want to learn more about ADAPT, the weekly meetings and then as well as a workshop scheduled in a few weeks here in Berlin with a short link there to go and get registered. Also on adaptframework.org, there's a link to the registration there as well. That's free for anyone to participate, but seating is limited, so register as early as you can to make sure that you can secure a spot.
Okay, Ben, thank you. Well, one quick question. Can you maybe say a few words about the relationship between AgGateway and AES at a high level and how the work of the two organizations kind of complements each other?
Yeah. So AEF is the Ag Equipment Electronics, Agricultural Industry Electronics Foundation. They are kind of the governing implementation body for the ISO 11783 standard. And there is a really good relationship between AEF and AgGateway. So there's a lot of membership that's the same within both organizations, as well as many of the same participants. And then there's been a pretty good working relationship, as I mentioned, with the SPADE project, where changes and different things were identified that would help make the ISO standard a little bit better for those use cases that were identified. So we've proposed several DDI additions or adjustments as a result of the AgGateway work, and that's been carried over to AEF and implemented as new DDIs and things are added to the data standards there. So does that cover what you were asking about?
Yeah. We have another question here, and that is there any recommendation how to transmit the data in real time except on a USB stick? Not really any recommendation. That's the area we left up to the plugin developers. So there's nothing that says you can't build in an API connection or something within the plugin to transfer data directly to a cloud-based system or several cloud-based systems, however you want that to work. That's completely up to the plugin developer. Like I said, the actual ADAPT framework is just going to be converting data from one format into between the one format and the ADAPT data model. So really up to the implementation of each company on how they want to handle that transfer, but it is fairly task file focused, so I don't know of anybody that's tried to implement like a live stream of data being converted through the ADAPT framework. I'm not 100% sure on how well that would work, but again, that might be something for a pull request if there's interest in doing something along those lines.
Thank you, Ben. Well done. And thanks to all of you who are interested in learning about Ag Gateway, its activities, and its resources. Be sure to check out other videos in the Ag Gateway Global Network video series. Take care and goodbye.